My name is Rachel, and this year has been a roller coaster I never saw coming. It all started so innocently, as these things often do. My husband, Nick, and I were doing our usual grocery run at the start of the year when we ran into her. Her name was Jessica. She had this perfectly styled blonde hair, a smile that felt a little too wide, and an aura that immediately made my skin crawl. But I didn't think much of it at the time. Nick introduced us in that casual way people do when they run into an old friend. Rachel, this is Jessica, an old friend from college. Nick said, his eyes lingering on her for just a moment too long. He seemed excited, more than he should have been. I laughed it off, thinking it was just the awkwardness of running into someone from his past. I shook her hand, feeling a little pang of something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't jealousy exactly, but I was uneasy. Still, I told myself it was nothing. We finished our shopping and went home, but the way Nick talked about her later that night stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed things that seemed off. At first, it was small. Nick's phone buzzing a little more frequently. His laughter while reading texts that he didn't share with me. But then, he started taking calls late at night. When I asked, he would say it was just work or an old buddy. He didn't mention Jessica by name, but I could feel her presence creeping into our lives. Things escalated when Jessica invited us to her Super Bowl party. It'll be fun, Nick said, smiling in that way that used to make me melt, but now just made me suspicious. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't think of a reason not to. When we got there, the party was loud, and everyone was having a good time. But the whole night, I couldn't shake the way Nick's eyes kept wandering toward Jessica. She was wearing this tight, low-cut top, and every time she walked past, Nick's gaze followed. He was blatantly checking her out, and she seemed to enjoy it. The worst part, she didn't even try to hide it. She smiled at him like they were sharing some private joke. I confronted him as soon as we got home. Nick, what the hell was that? You were practically drooling over her all night. He brushed it off. You're overreacting, Rachel. It was nothing. She's just a friend. A friend? I snapped, my voice rising. Friends don't look at each other like that. He just sighed, rubbing his forehead. You're making something out of nothing. But I knew, deep down I knew something wasn't right. A week later I decided to follow my gut. Nick told me he was going to play golf with his friends. Normally I wouldn't have questioned it, but this time I felt a knot in my stomach. When I tried calling him later, his phone went straight to voicemail. Something was wrong. I called my best friend Lucy and borrowed her car, not wanting to be spotted in mine. I drove by Jessica's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. And there it was, Nick's car parked in front of our house. My heart dropped into my stomach. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, Jessica came out to grab the mail, wearing nothing but a loose shirt and underwear. She didn't see me, but the sight of her like that made my blood boil. I knew then that Nick had been lying to me, but I had no solid proof, just this awful, gnawing suspicion. The days after that were a blur of anxiety. Nick became more distant, barely speaking to me or the kids. He spent hours on his phone, always smiling at something I wasn't a part of. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, that maybe I was being paranoid. But every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was him with her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to an electronics store and bought a small recording device, the kind you could hide easily. I slipped it into Nick's car, hoping for answers. A few days later, I retrieved it, my hands trembling as I pressed play. My heart shattered as I heard Nick's voice, soft, flirty, talking to Jessica. They giggled like teenagers, him calling her sexy, and her loving every second of it. The anger that flooded through me was indescribable. It felt like a fire consuming everything I thought I knew. I called Lucy again, and we swapped cars. I wasn't done. I needed to see it for myself. That night, I followed Nick to a bar. My heart raced as I parked far enough away to not be noticed, but close enough to see them. And there she was, sitting at the bar, waiting for him. The second Nick walked in, he went straight to her, touching her like he had forgotten I even existed. They laughed, they kissed, and then they disappeared into the back. That night, as I watched from the shadows, my heart clenched when Nick leaned in toward Jessica. His hand slid down her arm slowly, fingers brushing against her skin like it was the most natural thing in the world. She responded immediately, leaning into him, her lips parting in a soft laugh. They moved closer, their bodies pressed against one another, their chemistry undeniable. Nick's eyes were filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time, a hunger that tore at my insides. He whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, her hand gripping his wrist as they walked towards the back of the bar together. I followed, my stomach in knots as I trailed behind, careful not to make a sound. I reached the back hallway just as they disappeared through a door, leaving it ajar. Through the narrow crack, I saw them. Nick held her close, their foreheads touching as he murmured words I couldn't make out. Jessica's hand slid around his waist, pulling him tighter, her breath shallow. It was intimate, far too intimate for two people who weren't supposed to be anything more than old flames. His hand moved to her face, gently tilting her chin up before he pressed his lips to hers in a slow, deliberate kiss, one that felt like a betrayal I could never forgive. They moved together, swaying in sync as if no one else in the world existed. His lips traveled to her neck, lingering in a way that made it clear this wasn't the first time they'd been this close. Her body responded to him, arcing toward him like she craved every inch of his touch. The room seemed to pulse with their connection, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. My throat tightened, my heart shattered, and in that moment I knew the truth. This wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that had been growing between them while I was left in the dark. I felt sick. My world was crumbling before my eyes. But I wasn't ready to confront him. Not yet. The next morning, I cornered his co-worker, Adam, who had been at the bar with them earlier. "What's going on with Nick and Jessica?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fury. At first, Adam tried to deny it, but after a while, he couldn't look me in the eye. "Rachel, I didn't want to be the one to tell you this, but it's been going on for weeks." I thought he'd stop, but I didn't let him finish. The words hit me like a freight train. Weeks, not just a mistake, not a moment of weakness. This was planned, deliberate. That night, when Nick came home, I was waiting for him in the living room. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely holding together. He tried to act confused, but I could see the guilt in his eyes. "About what?" "About Jessica. About you sneaking around with her." Nick's face twisted in anger. "You've been spying on me?" "I had to, Nick. You've been lying to me for months," I yelled, my voice breaking. "I know everything. I saw you with her." He stared at me, the realization of how much I knew sinking in. "Rachel, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our family. How could you do this?" Nick looked at me for a long moment, his face hardening. "I can't do this right now." And with that, he turned and walked out the door. Later that night, his best friend James called me. "Rachel, listen, Nick told me everything. He wants to talk to you, to explain." But I wasn't ready to hear his excuses. Not yet. All I could think about was how my life had changed in the blink of an eye. I thought I knew Nick. We had built a life together, had kids together, and yet, here he was, sneaking around with another woman. I hung up the phone, the silence in the house feeling heavier than ever. How could he do this to me? To us? But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not without a fight.